Great. Okay. Well, I'm very excited to talk to you about this recent work on payday lending with Han Alcott, Josh Kim, and John Zinman. So, Jen, here is whether and how should we regulate payday lending? If you've never taken out a payday loan before, it's a very high interest, short-term unsecured loan that's taken out by very low income people who don't really have access to any other kind of credit. They're typically maxed out on their credit cards or not even eligible to have them. The typical size of a payday loan is about $350. And the way it works is you just walk into a payday lender's storefront, you show them your government ID and proof of employment, and you give them a post-dated check that is typically dated for a period of time that's 2 weeks from when you take it out and corresponds to your next payday. Now, what typically happens 2 weeks later is that that money is withdrawn. And it's, if you take out a $300 loan, the amount that's withdrawn is $345 because the interest is 15% just over 2 weeks. And after that money is withdrawn, what typically happens is that 80% of the time, people will go back to that payday lender storefront and just reborrow $300 again. Okay, so that leads to extremely long lending cycles that make many regulators worried because they think that people are trapping themselves in cycles of debt that they can't afford. Okay. The response to that, of course, is, well, you know, these cycles are worrying, but maybe these people really need the credit. Do they have anywhere else to turn to? If the choice is between taking out a $500 loan to fix your car or losing your job, sometimes, unfortunately, people do need to take out those extremely high interest loans. Now, at the center of this policy discussion, the key question that we think is, are borrowers acting in their own best interest? In particular, do people anticipate their repeat borrowing when they take out this loan? And are people time inconsistent? Do they borrow too much because of self-control problems? So we ran a survey and randomized experiment with 1,200 borrowers from a major payday lender to answer these questions, to estimate a model of imperfect self-control and incorrect beliefs. And we use that model to evaluate the welfare effects of various kinds of payday lending regulations. Okay. To run this experiment, we partnered with one of the largest nationwide lenders, and we also negotiated access to the Indiana statewide lending database. The reason we have that additional source of data is because we want to track not only the loans these borrowers take out from the lender, the capital L lender, but also from any other payday lender that they might go to. And we collected data from 41 centers, 2 weeks per center, between January and March of 2019. Okay? So the way the experiment worked is right after a borrower took out a loan from the payday lender, an enumerator would approach them with an iPad, inviting them to participate in our study. Okay? And the first key question that the borrowers had to answer was, what do you think is the chance that you will get another payday loan from any lender before a time period that is 8 weeks from now? Okay, so that's question number one, forecasting. Okay. Now, the second key question, and this relates to this question about self-control that I already introduced, is we wanted to have a quantitative assessment of whether borrowers are willing to pay a premium for an incentive that would reduce their future borrowing. So we introduced an incentive that was called $100 if you are debt-free, that involved borrowers receiving $100 if they did not take out a loan from any lender, not just ours, but any lender in Indiana for 8 weeks. And they would receive this money 12 weeks from when they take the study. The next question we ask is, if we give you this incentive, what do you think is the likelihood that you will borrow? Okay, so we estimate people's perceived impacts of the incentive. And then we had a series of questions that elicited people's valuations for this incentive. When I say valuation, what I mean is, what is the amount of money for sure that they would also receive 12 weeks from now, that such that they would be indifferent between this amount of money for sure and the $100 no borrowing incentive. And we did this with a series of binary questions. Do you want this $100 if you're debt free, or do you want this money for sure? Okay. And this is incentive compatible. People's decisions actually affected their outcomes. Okay, so result number one, so this is just from the first question in the study. What we found was quite surprising to us. People have a 74% chance of borrowing again in the next 8 weeks. And what do they believe? Well, they believe on average that they have a 70% chance of borrowing again. So people are not wildly over optimistic about how quickly they're going to get out of debt. What might be going on is that people get beat up and they learn pretty quickly, because there is one set of borrowers that is actually kind of wildly over optimistic, depending on what you think of a 20 percentage point underestimation. And those are borrowers who are at the payday lender storefront for the first time. But after you've been there a few times, and this is what I'm showing you here, if you're there for the 4th time, 6th time, you get pretty realistic pretty quickly. Okay. Perhaps because we don't think that much about kind of this effect of getting beat up and learning from how terrible it is to reborrow, our profession actually seems to have totally overestimated borrowers' naivete. So before we released the results of this study, we surveyed a bunch of behavioral economists, consumer finance economists, some regulators, asking them to predict what borrowers would think. And essentially, everyone thought that borrowers would be way, way worse at forecasting their future behavior than they actually are. Okay. Now, just because borrowers are good at forecasting their behavior doesn't mean they have no self-control problems. We indeed do find evidence that borrowers feel like they borrow too much, and they reveal a preference for constraining their future selves from borrowing in the future. So what I'm showing you here is the following. Okay? If borrowers were risk neutral and time consistent, then we can back out very simply what would have to be, on average, their valuation of this no borrowing incentive. Roughly speaking, it's about the amount of money that they would receive an expectation, and that's about $40. Now, borrowers are not risk seeking. We also had an additional question that I didn't show you that elicited their risk aversion. And as in all contexts, these borrowers are risk averse. Despite being risk averse, their valuation, their actual valuation of the $100 no borrowing incentive is way higher than it would be if they were risk neutral and perceived to be themselves to be time consistent. So this wedge here is a revealed perception that borrowers seem to believe themselves to have self-control problems. Okay? And this is consistent with a qualitative survey question where we just asked them, would you like to give yourself extra motivation to avoid payday loan debt in the future? Many of them said yes or very much. And the ones who said yes or very much also had a higher quantitative wedge as estimated by that valuation question. Okay. Now, we actually set up the survey in such a way that we can estimate a standard model of quasi-hyperbolic discounting and incorrect beliefs. Okay, so though borrowers perceive self-control, as I already said, is revealed by that valuation question, and the gap between borrowers' expected behavior and actual behavior is the gap between their perceived self-control and actual self-control. And we also have an estimate of the risk aversion, as I noted. So without going into details, these are all of the ingredients we actually need to formally estimate a model of time inconsistency and potentially incorrect beliefs about time inconsistency. Okay. With this model in hand, now that we have a quantitative model, we can actually engage in some policy evaluation. So using additional data on borrower behavior, the length of cycles, and so forth that we also got from the lender and the database, we can calibrate a fully quantitative model of borrower behavior, and we evaluate the following 3 regulations. So one is payday loan ban. Should we just ban payday lending? Okay. 18 states already do that, 32 do not. So there's a difference in opinion on that. 2 was a policy that was proposed by Richard Cordray, as part of the CFPB rule, which is a cooling off period, basically limiting the number of consecutive reborrowing that a borrower can engage in. So that's what I'm going to call a rollover restriction. And third is a loan size cap. Most states actually have them, but they vary. In Indiana, it's $600. In California, it's $250. So there's a question of what might an optimal loan size cap look like. Okay. Here's what our model suggests. Okay, so number one, there really doesn't seem to be much grounds for banning this because borrowers actually are overall pretty well calibrated in predicting their future behavior. And so while self-control biases and a little bit of misforecasting does reduce borrower welfare relative to a perfectly rational time-consistent benchmark, it does not reduce it that much. Borrowers gain from having access to payday loan on average, just not quite as much as they would if they were not biased at all. Okay? So banning is bad. In fact, reducing liquidity through more stringent caps is also bad. The only thing we find in our model that actually increases borrower welfare is a rollover restriction. Okay, again, that's the policy that basically says if you borrow, for example, 3 times in a row, you have to wait a little bit until you can do it again. And that's the kind of policy that's lighter touch and really zooms in on what we find as the main bias, which is that borrowers are sophisticated, but they have self-control problems. So this helps align borrowers' long-run preferences with their short-run behavior. Okay, so to conclude, what we found is that these payday loan borrowers in the US, they are actually pretty good at anticipating their repeat borrowing, but they are time inconsistent. Through the lens of the model that we estimate using the reduced 4 moments from the experiment, we find that there isn't that much ground for banning payday loans, but there definitely is room for lighter touch regulation like limits on repeat borrowing. Okay. The last point I like to clarify is just because banning payday loans is worse than nothing, it does not mean that payday loans are actually an optimal product. Okay. It's still pretty tragic that these borrowers have to take out such high interest loans. And so one of the things that Hunt and I, along with other co-authors, are working on now is trying to understand if there are better products that could be offered to borrowers and more borrowing, partnering with their partners in fintech to try to figure out what a better product might look like. Okay, so I'll end here, and I think I might have a minute or two for questions.
Thanks, Dimitri. Yeah, we have time for one question. Timothy, go ahead.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. You listed 3 separate options as far as policies. However, was there any further looking into for any type of debt restructure as far as a policy that would allow people who were borrowed and weren't able to repay to pay like 10 or 20 cents on the dollar in order to reconcile the situation?
Sorry, I didn't fully understand the. Are you saying, are there ways you're talking? Sorry, your question was about debt restructuring?
Yes, you listed 3 different policy options as far as different ways in order to regulate the industry for payday lending. However, as far as debt restructure, is there any further research as far as being able to use some type of debt restructure and paying some like 10, 20 cents on the dollar in order
like an
to
installment
be able
loan
to
product,
repay
for example. Like an installment loan product where you take out a $300 loan, you have $345 that you pay, but you have 8 weeks to do it. And you can pay it back in 4 equal installments. So that's kind of one example of an alternative product that, in a sense, restructures the debt that these borrowers incur. And that's one of the kinds of things that we are exploring.
Great. Thank you, Dimitri. Now we're going to move on to our last presentation of the day, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion and conclude. Our last presenter is Nick Swanson from Berkeley. Hi, Nick.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone. Let me just share screen. All right. Okay. Yeah, really excited to present this project today. This is joint work with Supreet, as well as Ned Augenblick at UC Berkeley, Kelsey Jack at Santa Barbara, and Felix Messier at the University of Zambia. And our project is called Budget Neglect and Consumption Smoothing, a field experiment on seasonal hunger. And so the motivating fact for this project is that across different contexts, we see low-income individuals exhibit consumption cyclicality. So in the right-hand side figure, we see that US food stamp recipients decrease their food expenditures over the course of a month after food stamp receipt. In the left-hand chart, which will be the context of our project, Zambian farmers also showed consumption declines. So we see high levels of consumption in the months after harvest, but then consumption declines by around 10% in the months leading up to the next harvest. These cycles could be driven by many different contextual factors, but in this paper, we're going to offer a new explanation, which is guided by our first empirical finding, which is that despite experience, individuals seem to believe that this cycle will be different. So we're going to sort of document this in the following way. We're going to go to a sample of Zambian farmers in the months after harvest and ask them to forecast how much of their maize stock they're going to have remaining in 3 months' time. And we're going to incentivize this forecast. So the green dot shows average forecasts in our sample, and the yellow bar average realization. So people believe that they're going to have much more savings than they actually do. In fact, 80% of farmers are over-optimistic. We also asked farmers to give us their worst case forecast. So what is going to be your savings in the absolute worst case? And strikingly, 65% of farmers have less than their worst case forecast. So what mechanism is giving rise to this over-optimism, and does it meaningfully impact consumption smoothing behavior? We're going to offer a new hypothesis in this project that we call budget neglect. And the idea is pretty simple. Budgeting is a hard process. You need to think across a wide array of goods into different moments in the future. What we think may be going on is that the time the agent is making their consumption plan, they may be forgetting some future expenditures. So to give you sort of a simple example, I'm sitting here with some money in my wallet, and I'm trying to think about how much of that I can afford to spend today. Now I know I have a big car payment coming up, so I need to set some money aside for that. But I forget these smaller gas payments that I also need to make to keep my car running. So because I forget that, I feel a little more flush today than I actually am. And I spend maybe a little bit more than I can afford. And then when these gas payments hit in the future, I need to cut back on other consumption to make those. The idea of our project is just that if I'd thought through those payments initially, maybe I would have just saved a little bit more in the first place. This mechanism is distinct from present bias. And in this project, we're going to focus on a testable implication of our model, but it doesn't follow from the present bias model, which is that improved attention to budget items can alter beliefs and consumption paths. So how are we going to do this? So we're going to work with the maize farmers in rural Zambia that I showed you on slide 1, have experience with these consumption cycles. They harvest maize once per year, and this is like their bank account they need to make last. And they store it in these maize bags. This is kind of like a unit of account in this context. This kind of approximates an eat the pie problem, where households need to allocate these bags of maize to different types of consumption and expenditures. So they need to eat some directly, spend some on unexpected expenditures like school fees, and they might have to use some for unexpected shocks like health fees or funerals. Okay, so our working model of behavior is that agents are forgetting these future expenditures. So we want to design a treatment that's going to make them think through this consumption plan and maybe remember these future expenditures they may be forgetting. So how do we do this? It's pretty simple. We sit them down and make them make a plan with their maize. We print out these pieces of paper that have pictorial representations of common expenditure categories in this environment. So things like consumption, school fees, household supplies. We then offer them a set of thumbtacks with one thumbtack representing one bag of maize. So if you have like 10 bags of maize, we give you 10 thumbtacks. And then we just leave you to it and ask you to put these thumbtacks into the different expenditure categories. Simply put, we're just asking you to make a plan. Importantly, after we make the plan, we take this piece of paper away, and during the planning process, our enumerators aren't suggesting to you allocations. You're just left to think through it on your own. So for the treatment group, you do this planning activity that I just described. And then afterwards, we're going to offer you labels with pictorial representations of these expense categories that you can affix to your maize bags. So you can put a picture on your maize bag that says this bag is for school fees, this bag is for consumption, etc. However, we're only going to give you these labels 2 months after you make the plan. They don't go on immediately. For the control group, we're also going to offer you this labeling technology, but you're not going to do the budgeting beforehand. So we're going to do household level randomization with these 800 or so farmers, and then we're going to conduct surveys over the course of the next agricultural year to see how this intervention changes sort of beliefs and behavior over the course of the year. Okay, so again, our model, people forget expenditures, our treatment is making them think through it. We're going to sort of test 4 predictions that would be consistent with this model and treatment. But first is that if there are some expenditures you're forgetting, there's going to be some expenditures that you remember and revise your beliefs upward about how much you need to spend on them. We measure this in the following way. So for the treatment group, before they do the budgeting, we ask them for their prior of how much of this maize do you think you need to sell to cover expenses. And then we can compare this to how many bags of maize they allocate to expenditure categories in their plan that they would need to sell. The right-hand side figure shows the difference between these 2 measures. The solid line is the prior of how much maize I need to sell. The dashed lines under different assumptions show how much I end up putting into my plan. What this shows is that these treated households are revising upwards their beliefs about how much they need to spend on these expenditure items after undergoing the budgeting by substantial amounts, 20 to 60%. Okay, so the next sort of prediction is that if I remember I have these future expenditures, this kind of has a wealth effect today. I have a little bit less money that's kind of for discretionary consumption. I'm going to feel a little bit poorer and reduce my consumption today. We test this as follows. So we do a willingness to pay exercise with households at the end of a baseline survey. We offer them the chance to buy a discretionary consumption item with their own maize, and we elicit their valuation of this discretionary consumption using a BDM mechanism. The right-hand side figure shows the CDF evaluations, the red line being the treatment and the blue dashed line, the control valuations. We see a substantial reduction in the treatment group's valuations of this discretionary consumption, which we interpret as consistent with this prediction. Okay, so that's all good and fine, but I guess what we really care about is like, does this translate into sort of meaningful savings and longer term outcomes? That was sort of a motivation we started with. In particular, if people are reducing consumption today, we expect them to be saving more and then having more money to consume and spend later in later months. Okay, so the right-hand side figure is showing total consumption and expenditures for treatment and control households over the course of a year after our budgeting, with the red line being the treatment group's expenditure profile, the blue dashed line, the control groups. So we can see that the treatment group is reducing their consumption or conversely increasing their savings immediately by 15%, and this is prior to the application of any labels on their maize bags. This generates higher savings later in the year. Households enter the hungry season with an additional month's worth of food. Okay, so but does this savings matter? Is this important? Well, what we find in our surveys is that households report reducing their off-farm labor and increasing their on-farm investments. And this translates into 9% greater harvest revenues at the next harvest, suggesting that this increases the size of a pie for the next year. So it seems like this savings has important consequences. Okay, so in the last couple of minutes before I wrap up, I just want to sort of ask, we did this seemingly pretty simple intervention and it seems like it had pretty sizable impacts. Why do farmers then not figure out how to do this on their own? Why do they not adjust their forecasts? We can't answer this perfectly, but we're going to talk through some suggestive reasons why this may be the case. We think about it, there's a couple different ways that farmers could make forecasts. They could do sort of a forward-looking analytical reasoning process, and that's the approach that we take in our paper. But we argue that it's probably pretty cognitively challenging. When we ask treatment farmers at baseline whether they've ever done this in the past, less than 2% say they've ever done such detailed planning previously. Also at Adeline, we elicit their willingness to pay to receive the intervention again. 90% of a treatment group is willing to pay something, suggesting that it's something that's both valuable but hard to replicate on your own. Okay, well, since people are used to these cycles, why don't they just use their past experience to update as a heuristic? It may be hard for me to figure out exactly how much savings I'll have in a few months, but if I know in the past I always have nothing, I can just forecast nothing again. We test how people recall the past. At the end of our survey, we ask people to recall how much savings they had in the previous agricultural year. And we offer pretty sizable incentives to them if they recall it correctly. And we ask them to recall on a date where we visited, so we verified how much maize they had. The right-hand side figure is the CDF of a recall error. And we can see that 70% of households recall having had more maize than they actually saved in the past. So we think that maybe this distortion to memory may be making it hard for households to update and produce sort of more realistic forecasts in the future. So just to conclude, we started off by showing we saw a systematic over-optimism despite experience. We showed that sort of a simple planning exercise where people think through their expenditures has meaningful impacts on beliefs and behavior. And we provide some suggestive evidence for why individuals may find it hard to update and make more realistic forecasts in the future. Oh, thanks. That's it.
Okay, maybe we have time for just one question for Nick, and then we'll have a short discussion and conclude. Short group discussion and conclude. Any questions for Nick? Okay. Nick, I might have robbed you of your questions by answering a couple in the chat. So why don't we, in the interest of time, move to just the group panel discussion? I'm sure people are also fading a little bit from Zoom fatigue. So let me open it up to the audience as a whole. Any questions for any of the panelists?
I actually had a question for Nick, if we could.
Okay.
It was actually about the rosy memory. It strikes me as a bit odd that you would keep having rosy memories of the past of something that was pretty painful. You know, presumably not having enough to eat is a pretty bad experience. And so maybe this is beyond the scope of the study, but do you have any intuition from like qualitative work or something why people would keep having this rosy view of painful experiences again and again that they go through every year?
Yeah, so I think part of what you're pointing to is maybe this is something that's kind of like motivated. So it's painful to think through a bad past or a difficult future. And so I kind of distort my perceptions of what it will be to sort of alleviate some of that pain and suffering. We can't sort of say for sure that that's going on. We probably think that that's possible. One thing that we do find that's kind of inconsistent with that view is that we offer households sort of different levels of incentives, both to make forecasts and to recall the past. And we don't find that that has a huge impact on people's recollections of their forecasts, which seems a little bit inconsistent with the idea that like I'm trading off having a particular belief against some kind of like material reward. But we do find that like in a lot of cases, the direction of the bias we find is consistent with a kind of motivated reason. So people think the past is better than it was, future expenditures will be lower than they will be. And in evidence I didn't show you, people also believe that they're sort of better planners than other similar.
Great, thank you, Nick. Mahesh, you have a question?
Yeah, my question actually was also for Nick. I was just curious about what are the kinds of, if you have a sense of like what are the kinds of expenses that might be sort of neglected when people do plan. I was just curious, because the example you gave was, it might be sort of like the little expenses. So maybe you're sort of focusing on the big expense, like a car breaking down, but you're neglecting the smaller expenses in that domain. Or one could imagine like maybe that kind of like low probability events would be hard to plan for. So I guess I was wondering, I don't know if your data sort of get at that at all in terms of like what comparing control group versus the treatment group, but I was curious about that. And then also I think for the last piece that you mentioned about why people don't do the detailed planning, I was curious about whether you think that people understand that it's important to do the planning, but still just don't engage in it. It sort of strikes me as like a form of like math anxiety potentially, like where there's sort of like, you don't want to engage with something that's a very stressful experience to go through the kind of budgeting, even though you might think of it as kind of an important thing to be doing. So just those questions.
Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna fudge the answers to these a little bit because this isn't stuff that we've really dug into yet in the data. But I think that sort of in terms of like which things are people sort of neglecting or paying attention to, I think sort of our prior was the same as yours, that there may be sort of, so one thing that people tell us afterwards in focus groups is basically like, look, we never really keep aside stuff maybe enough for emergencies, because each individual emergency that may arise is kind of low probability, but something comes up. And so maybe doing this budgeting activity is helping them do something like this. But yeah, we don't, maybe in a month or two, let me get back to you in terms of like what people are actually sort of forgetting. And I mean, Dimitri is the expert on attention, so he can probably talk to in the theoretical literature, like what people think people do or don't pay attention to. And then in terms of sort of, is there an anxiety that sort of stops people engaging with planning? I think that we do some sort of supplemental sort of focus group work with farmers with sort of at the end of the year. And it does seem like we find some evidence consistent with that explanation. But I need to look at it more closely again to see if it looks like that explains everything.
Dimitri or Heather, do you want to weigh in at all on any of this, on Nick's response?
No, I mean, I think it's a really interesting paper, and it presents a lot of interesting new puzzles as well to dig into, which is something I always like about papers like this. So convincing in what it does, and then opening a bunch of new questions about kind of how this is so persistent and why.
Seconded.
Yeah, sorry. Dimitri, I meant more like, is there evidence on what people do and don't pay attention to? But let me actually move to.
I think there's evidence, but I don't know. I'm not the person to ask, contrary to what Nick said.
Yes, a lot of that literature. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No, go for it, Heather.
I was just going to say the literature, focuses on kind of like inattention, often focuses on what's rational and what's not, and kind of the rational inattention space, which is, it's a very different piece than sort of the set of questions that you're asking. And so I think this is kind of the very practical field side of that, which is nice to see.
Imran, go for it.
So I just had a question for Dimitri, just curious based on the data you showed. So you also have the Indiana data set, which allows you to look at how individuals are borrowing potentially from multiple payday lenders. So I was just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit more, and whether you have a sense of whether, why people are borrowing, what are the reasons why they're going to these lenders in the first place, and how far away are they from a situation in which they're borrowing from one to pay off another?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it actually is very rare for them to borrow from one to pay off another. Well, that particular thing basically never happens, but it's also very rare for them to even borrow from multiple lenders. And there are two reasons for that. So one is the borrowing limit in Indiana, which is $600, applies to borrowing from all lenders combined. And in fact, the reason they have that database, which we kind of was great for research purposes, but the reason they have that is so they can enforce that regulation. The other thing is, basically what people do is they just go to the lender that's in their neighborhood, that's closest to them, and that's where they go. And the reason they don't need to borrow from another lender to pay off the first is because there's just no incentive. It's, what happens when you borrow $100 is $115 is withdrawn from your bank account in 2 weeks. And technically, when I use the word reborrow, it's not actually revolving debt. What reborrow means in practice is people just go back to their original lender, to the storefront, and they just take out that $100 loan. Again, because technically revolving debt with a single lender is also illegal in most states, but it's a completely ineffective regulation because people just come back and they just get a new loan. In terms of what people use the loans for, it's all sorts of things. Oftentimes it is basically for unexpected expenses. It's like your car breaks down, your utility bill is way higher than it normally is because you have a poorly weatherized house and you got unlucky with the weather this month, and you can't kind of keep afford to, if you keep not paying it, you're going to lose power. So it's that kind of stuff. Medical expenses, sometimes it's predictable ones. It's like during the holiday season, people will sometimes use the loans to bridge paycheck to paycheck when they have kind of a particularly high predictable expense. But it's that set of things. To the extent that there's one more thing that could be fixed in the market, I have a sense that the big reason for the payday loans is just that people get paid only every 2 weeks. So if people, other kinds of solutions that allow people to more easily obtain money from, on a more frequent basis, that would actually negate some of the need for payday loans. It's just some of this artificial rules about getting paid every 2 weeks or every 4 weeks. That's kind of part of the problem, and people take out loans to bridge kind of paychecks. So, yeah.
Great, thank you, Dimitri. So we're at 12:15. So what I propose we do is we'll adjourn the conference for the day. We start again tomorrow morning with our keynote address with Abhijit Banerjee at 8:30 a.m.